The 1980s brought technological innovation and resulted in the wide restructuring of the world. It saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the victory of capitalism over socialism. It saw the rise of fashion brands, CDs, home video viewing, mobile phones, and the massive consumption of toys. It was a time for wild individualism and expressive personal style. It saw the breaking down of gender identities and saw the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, in which markets were left to look after themselves, a process that took over Britain and America. But this decade of deregulation also saw miners' strikes, rights over the poll tax, and football hooliganism. But class inequity, fears of the IRA, gender discrimination, and system abuse of power are not what many of us remember about the 80s. Many of us look back on the 80s fondly, as its tone and aesthetic has become a recurring element in today's media landscape. The question is why? Why has the 1980s had such a lasting impact on our culture, and why do we only remember the good things? Why are we looking back to the 80s instead of ahead to the future? What has the 1980s ever done for us? The technological revolution of the 1980s was also seen in music, as the decade saw a move away from vinyl to CDs and music videos. The 80s made music available to the masses and gave birth to a new method of distribution and consumption. It gave musicians new visibility and pop stars reached new heights of stardom. The 80s saw the popularisation of bands such as Duran Duran, Bananarama, Martha and the Muffins, and Rick Astley. But with all the cheesy pop, we also had innovative acts such as Dismiss, Style Council, New Order, and Michael Jackson. These artists gave today's musicians ideas for tunes, beats, and music videos. Hip-hop, born in 1970s New York City, became rapidly popular throughout the 1980s. Black Americans found a voice with which they could talk about their cultural experiences, and maybe even voice a rejection of racism and offer a criticism of a white capitalistic society. Hip-hop was a new and fresh way for Black Americans to express themselves other than through classic blues. Indeed, the legacy of the 1980s has cast a long shadow, and much of today's music finds its roots there. Today we look back on the 80s music with reverence. We have 80s clubs, radio stations, Rick Astley memes, and possibly the greatest innovation and one of the most popular things about the 80s that still remains relevant to this day is film. Whether it be the world of politics, fashion, technology, gaming, music or film, the 1980s has had a remarkable influence on the way we live our lives today. One reason for this is because the people creating our culture's products today grew up in the 1980s and are nostalgic for those formative years. Another reason is that, as a culture, we are looking back to less problematic times without division and conflict. While the 1980s certainly had those things, we have largely forgotten about them in the sands of time. Instead, we remember the 80s as a time of optimism, being told you can live the capitalist dream and earn whatever you wanted. Today, we are returning to the positives of the past, as a way of retreating from the problems of the present. While we may have forgotten many of the 80s problems, you cannot deny the 80s lives on. Many of us are never going to give them up. Possibly the greatest innovation and one of the most popular things about the 80s that still remains relevant to this day is film. Almost 40 years later, movies from the 80s are still popular. They are re-screened on TV and cinemas and have sequels, prequels and remakes being made. For example, years after the original trilogy ended in 1983, Star Wars continues to extend into prequels and sequels. In 1999, the prequel trilogy was introduced with The Phantom Menace to elaborate on the original trilogy and ended in 2005 with Revenge of the Sith. It was rebooted with The Force Awakens in 2015 after Disney bought the rights to the Star Wars universe. And in 2016, Rogue One started a new series of prequels. To this day, they are continuing the storyline that started back in 1977. Even movies made after the 80s make frequent references to the decade's pop culture or base their aesthetic in 1980s style. Many of these films have been praised for their stories, cinematography, practical and digital effects. Even people that didn't grow up watching these classics still enjoy them today. Movies such as Back to the Future, E.T., Top Gun and many other films are considered to be the pinnacle of American filmmaking. The impact of the 1980s on film can also be seen in horror movies, a genre which continues to be a huge part of our film culture today. These are also good examples of 80s movies that continue to get sequels and prequels, with both Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street being rebooted in the 2000s. These horror films greatly benefited from the biggest shift occurring in the 1980s film culture, the rise of the VHS. In the early 1980s, a new technology emerged, video cassette recorders, and soon the marketplace was filled with films to be viewed at home. These films released on the video did not need to be classified by the BBFC, they were unregulated. This meant that uncensored films, those which might have been banned or cut in the cinema, were released on VHS to be watched by anyone at home. This led to fears of obscene content finding its way into the home and infecting children. So in 1983, moral watchdog the National Viewers and Listeners Association, headed by Mary Whitehouse, petitioned a Conservative government to ban these films.
There are now over 700 pieces of scientific... I'll send you some. I'll send you the lot. Scientific what? Scientific research internationally showing a link between televised and social violence.
Here, the term video nasty was coined to describe the perceived graphically gory films. The press picked up this campaign and went further, blaming a bunch of violent crimes on exposure to unregulated videos. As a result, working under the Obscene Publications Act, the Director of Public Prosecution's Office drew up a list of around 60 potential obscene. These films were frequently seized and the distributors/exhibitors were fined or sent to prison. The government then passed the Video Recordings Act in 1984 to regulate this new marketplace. Here, all films now needed to be classified by the BBFC, meaning that the BBFC had to classify both theatrical releases and films to watch at home. The 1980s was a time for innovation, especially in the world of gaming. In this decade, gaming went from arcades into people's homes, from the public realm to the private one. Indeed, while Pac-Man was still packing out arcades up and down the country, other titles were released for home consumption, and suddenly people could play Donkey Kong, Tetris and Mario in the privacy of their own home. Millions bought computing systems such as Nintendo, Amiga, Atari, Sega Master System and the Game Boy. Gaming was a way for most people to escape from the real world. People who were called nerds or geeks and bullied escaped into a safer environment, an environment of digital friends. Gaming opened up the world for them. But today, there are no safe environments in the digital world. Gamers find no haven from bullying because of online gaming and social media. As we saw from scandals such as #Gamergate, people are bullied in the online world and discriminated against in terms of race, gender and sexuality. Might this be why we long for the lost decade of the 80s, a time of less abuse and bullying, a time for escape for gamers? Might this be why games such as Pac-Man and Mario keep getting reboots and remasters? A throwback to the golden days of gaming where those bullied in person found a way to escape.